Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thanks for coming out tonight for an event we've been looking forward to for some time. My name's Michael White. I'm the AVP of Campus and Community Planning at UBC, and this is our third speaker event for Campus Vision 2050. So welcome, and I want to thank you for coming out in person, and those folks that are at home on live stream. Welcome tonight. Brett Sparrow was going to be giving the land acknowledgement. He is unable to attend tonight, so I just wanted to thank Brett and all the folks that we've been working with at Musqueam through Campus Vision 2050. We've done something pretty unusual for UBC in this process, and it's been pretty transformative for all of us as a team to co-develop an engagement process with Musqueam for the development of the new vision. And so I just want to thank the team at Musqueam who've been working with and acknowledge that this is traditional Musqueam territory and that we're working with Musqueam to develop the vision as well as the many communities across the campus. Campus Vision is coming to a pretty important inflection point. We have a draft vision that is now online and circulating, and it's the culmination of many, many months of technical work and engagement at a number of different levels and throughout the campus community. There's some big themes that are embedded in Campus Vision 2050, and tonight is a very important discussion about one of those themes. It's nothing new. We've been engaging with the community for years now about the climate emergency and about climate action and what we're doing as a campus community as we grow. And that's something that's inherent in Campus Vision 2050, that this is a community and an institution that needs to grow, that needs institutional capacity, it needs residential capacity for growth. How do we do that responsibly, I think, is one of the big challenges for this conversation. And it's building on work that I think has been quite successful in the last couple years at reducing GHGs in the institutional part of the campus through our climate action plan. We want to extend that conversation. We want to extend it into the neighborhoods and update our climate action plan for the neighborhoods with similar ambition. And we also want that conversation to extend beyond straight ahead climate action. We want to talk about local ecology and biodiversity in the place that we want UBC to be. And so while we do this, and this is something, I'm going to introduce our guests here in a second, I'll stop talking shortly, something I've picked up on through different engagements with Simon that I've watched around what can UBC do to be a leader and continue to be a leader in some of these areas and actually be a role model. And I think that's what this vision and the updates to our land use plan, we don't want this just to be another official community plan. We want this to be married to the academic mission and married to being a model, a role model globally about how to do this, how to grow and to grow responsibly. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce our guests tonight. And moderating, I have Zana Mody, who's a graduate student and will be moderating tonight. And very lucky to have Simon Donner. And Simon, if you don't know, is an interdisciplinary climate scientist. I'm reading this verbatim. And his research focuses on the intersection of climate science, marine science, and public policy, because I want to get that right. He's committing to helping us regular folks understand climate change so that we can all make informed decisions. And I think that makes him a perfect lead for this kind of discussion tonight. So I want to welcome Zana and Simon to the podium and to walk us through the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Just going to give one moment. So I've been here in UBC and in British Columbia for 15 years now. Be my 15th anniversary just occurred a few days ago, actually. And since I've been here, I came here as this climate scientist, a job at the university. I've been asked a lot of questions about climate change. And at the beginning, the most common question was, is it real? Like, is this actually happening? And then that pretty quickly morphed into, is it us? Are we to blame? Is it our greenhouse gas emissions, fossil fuel burning? And then that quickly morphed into, what should we do about it? Which was the question that made me the happiest, to be honest. Although as a scientist, the earlier ones are a little easier for me to answer. But then something happened a few years ago. The question changed again, and it became, are you optimistic? Or sometimes the flip side, are you worried? And I hear this from students, I hear it from family, I hear it from friends, I hear it from people in line at the coffee shop, and I definitely hear it from the media. It's like the CBC put out like an internal memo telling them they have to ask every climate expert this question. And the only way I can make sense of it is to think that people are looking for hope. Because extreme events have ravaged the world over the past few years. No one living in the lower mainland needs to be told this, right? We've had as much of an experience with this as anywhere else on the planet in the past few years. And climate change is hitting home in a way that it maybe didn't for a lot of people 10 years ago, 15 years ago when I started here, or 25 years ago when I first started sort of studying and working on this subject. We see climate change all around us, but yet it feels like the responses, the actions we're taking, the actions we're seeing or not seeing governments around the world take, they all seem woefully inadequate. And so, as far as I can understand, people seem to be looking wherever they can for some hope. And if you're the one that answers questions in front of a classroom or in front of the media, you're the one that gets asked the question. And what I've learned from this is that I am, as a person, quite optimistic about climate action. But I'm also just happen to be quite optimistic as a person. If you ask me if a problem can be solved, I usually say yes, even if the odds don't look that great. And my optimism, or if I was pessimistic, that's not really the issue, though. Because successfully addressing climate change, it's not about optimism and it's not about pessimism. At this point, it is about courage, right? The planet is warming faster than at any point in the history of human civilization. And I don't say those words lightly, but we have data that shows there has been no warming like this since humans lived in communities, starting around 12,000 years ago, right? And it's warming faster than most evidence shows us that people and societies and most environments and ecosystems can adapt. That's why climate change is concerning. And so what we need now is courage. And it's courage not just from the climate experts, it's courage from everybody in society. And we need this courage because what we really need to be doing over the next 30 years is to be uprooting the systems with which we're used to managing things, they're used to living, how the energy system works, for example, right? And this takes guts, right? We need the guts and the courage to get onto a new path. And so to kind of demonstrate what this means for climate policy and for decision making, I'm going to show you a graph and a series of lines, and just bear with me here. It can sometimes take a little courage to show a graph in a large room. This is global data. So we're starting really big picture, even though the subject today is UBC's campus, but we're doing this for a reason. So what I'm showing you here is global greenhouse gas emissions, although it's actually, the data here is just from carbon dioxide. It's a little bit easier to show and to graph for that purpose. So global carbon dioxide emissions going back to 1960 through observations. You can see a very big recent dip that was due to the pandemic lockdowns. A lot of vehicles and airplanes not in the air, et cetera, right? So what I've done on this green line is using data straight out of last year's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, took some data from the report and calculated what a trajectory based on that data that would let us give us a 2/3 chance, like a likely chance of avoiding 4 degrees of warming. This is what emissions would look like. And then we can do the same thing if we wanted to avoid like a 2/3 chance of 3 degrees of warming. And so we get a line. It's a bit steeper. Right? Now, the secret is I moved here 15 years ago, but I thought of moving here 30 years ago. Because when I was an undergraduate student, I was doing a combination of physics and liberal arts. I had wide interests, but I happened to be good at physics for whatever reason. And that did lead me to eventually studying climate science, which at its core is a lot of physics and chemistry. But at the same time, I was torn about whether I should go to graduate school or I should move out west and become a ski instructor. And I actually wrote an essay about it for class once. I did not do well on the essay. And so when I look at this graph, it makes me think of ski slopes, right? And that the green, the 4-degree slope, it's sort of a green run, or what we would call an easy slope or a bunny slope or among skiers. And the blue line is like a more difficult or an intermediate slope, using the ratings that ski areas, Whistler, Cypress, et cetera, all use, right? So these are reasonably easy intermediate slopes. These are things that are quite possible that we could do. But if we want to avoid 2 degrees of warming, the upper limit that's in the Paris Climate Agreement, we're looking at a much steeper slope, right? We need to go down a black diamond, what skiers or snowboarders will use to refer to as an advanced run. And if we want to avoid 1.5 degrees of warming, the lower limit in the Paris Climate Agreement, we're looking at a much steeper slope. This is really like an experts-only double black diamond, right? Real transformational change to see emissions drop that radically. In fact, this slope is so steep that you probably wouldn't be allowed to go down it. They'd probably have a gate at the top. It would say, ski at your own risk, and they would say, we're not patrolling this area. If you get in an accident, you're on your own. And the challenge here is that the longer that the world and all the entities within it delay action, the steeper each one of these slopes is going to get, right? As it is, a lot of experts are going to tell you that the 1.5 degree slope is already so steep that it's dangerous or actually like technologically impossible to navigate, right? And if we delay much longer, the 2 degree slope is going to start looking like that 1.5 degree slope, right? And so the target that you hear a lot of getting to zero or net zero emissions by 2050, and when scientists say net zero, they just mean getting to the point that there's no longer greenhouse gases being added to the atmosphere, which means all the emissions that are remaining have to be countered by things that pull greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, like planting trees, right? This goal of net zero by 2050 comes from curves like this. Not these exact curves, but from analysis like this. And it has been adopted by a lot of governments around the world. It's been recommended by the scientific community and adopted by governments from the level of national governments like Canada to individual cities and jurisdictions, right? And it comes from this type of thinking, right? That if we want to avoid 1.5 degrees of warming, and certainly, you know, and depending on what odds you're looking at for your chance of avoiding this warming, 2 degrees of warming, you need that goal of getting the net zero by 2050. So, and to think about how much that means we have left to burn in terms of how much carbon could we burn before we surpass this, well, if you're a scientist or a mathematician, you take the area under the curve. It's a calculus problem. And you calculate that area under the curve, and that's the total amount that the world can emit left. Calculus is not the most friendly thing to talk about in this sort of setting, or really in any setting, so I like to think of it as pi. This is a much happier thing than calculus. Think of a pi as how much carbon we have left to burn. And then the question becomes, well, how big of a slice can different regions of the world take, can different entities take, can different countries take, et cetera, right? And a lot of thinking has gone into how do we fairly distribute this pie, right? What is an equitable way to do this? What is a realistic way to do it? Because you think of Canada, a developed nation, our per person greenhouse gas emissions are 4 times that of the world average and 9 times that of India. So we are disproportionately responsible both today and historically for the problem. So we have, given a certain sense of equity, a greater responsibility to deal with the problem. So that maybe influences how large a slice we could take, right? But the other way to think about it is not just about equity, it's about reality. If a country like Canada, the United States, or really any country in the world takes too big a slice, it also just makes it less likely we can solve the problem overall. Right? It's not just about fairness. If we just take too big a slice, it's probably just not possible that we're going to keep our diet to just eating this pie. And we might end up with more warming than the world intended, right? And so responsibility or equity is one of the main principles people usually use when thinking about who has what responsibility to deal with climate change. But there's another piece that's worth thinking about, and it's ability. Who's most able to respond to the problem? Now, often, those most responsible are also most able because of resources, both financial resources and other forms of resources, having the technological ability to respond. So I gave you the idea for this for Canada. Let's think about British Columbia specifically within Canada. BC has a unique ability to solve this problem. British Columbia, like Manitoba and Quebec, have a leg up. We have close to zero carbon electricity in our province. This is true in Manitoba and somewhat in Quebec. And it's because of hydropower, whether you like it or not, right? That is providing us with zero carbon electricity and a greater opportunity in the moment to electrify the economy, which is the thing that all the energy experts says is going to be necessary to really solve climate change. To look at our vehicles becoming electric, to look at home heating and cooling often becoming electric, right? That's one of the big solutions. So BC has a leg up as well in terms of ability, not just responsibility. If we take this further, though, so we take these ideas of responsibility and ability, right? And we zero in to where we are today, to UBC as an institution and the campus as a community, right? We have the same responsibility. We have the same advantages, right? We're in British Columbia. We're on the same electricity grid. But we also have a different responsibility, right? And Michael was talking about this before. We have the responsibility that comes with being a leading publicly funded institution of higher education. Not just the higher education part, but the publicly funded part. The university is being supported by the public purse to be a leader in educating and doing research on this very issue that I'm talking about, right? That's how I get paid, right? And so we have this mandate to educate and train the leaders of tomorrow, and many of you are here in this room, to research the challenges of climate change and to spread our knowledge and our discoveries to support the province and communities around us, but I'd argue also Canada and the world. And so it is our institution's role to be a leader. And so when we think about the actions that the campus is going to take going forward to 2050, given the backdrop of climate change and knowing that the world, to avoid the levels of warming that we've agreed to try to avoid in the Paris Climate Agreement, knowing that the world is aiming to avoid, get the net zero emissions by 2050, it really says that places like UBC need to be leading the way. Because if people like us in institutions like this and in settings like this can't demonstrate what's possible and can't do this, how do we expect other communities to do it who don't have all the privileges and advantages that we have, right? And if we can't demonstrate what's possible, if we logistically can't figure out how to do it, well, then there's pretty small chance that we're really going to stop the levels of warming that the world has agreed to. Places like UBC, whether you like it or not, we've been pushed to the front and we need to be ahead of everybody. Right? And so the good news, I would say, is that the campus, the institutional part of the campus, has taken this to heart, and Michael was alluding to this. So this is UBC's goals for the campus operations going forward. And you'll notice 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, so going to zero by 2035. 15 years ahead of that global goal, ahead of the goal that the Canadian government has set. And I think this is wonderful, right? This is setting an example, using the university setting an example. Again, this is campus operations, right? But I would say, and as Michael was alluding to, we can go further, thinking about the community as a whole, but also thinking about the community and the campus and what we can do to demonstrate to other communities, what we can do to take What actions we can take to leverage our position to see change and affect change in other communities around us, right? And so I would argue in a way that we should be thinking not about zero. We should be thinking about negative emissions, right? And I don't necessarily mean pulling carbon dioxide out of the air on campus, but that would be a good idea too if we could figure out how to do it. I mean thinking about what can we do to both get to zero on campus, but also to leverage our knowledge and leverage the choices we make on campus to have an impact on surrounding communities and have them reduce their emissions as well, right? And this type of change I'm talking about, this incremental thinking isn't going to work, right? This isn't going down the bunny slope, right? We need real transformational thinking, right? And in 2021, I was fortunate enough to be appointed to the Net Zero Advisory Body, which is a body that the Canadian government created to give advice on realizing this goal of getting to net zero emissions. Why I'm on it, I think I just happened to be home when they called. I don't really know. But after we were appointed, our group developed a series of values and principles. We had 3 months to come up with an initial report. And we said, well, we should come up with a set of values and principles that we will use in all the advice to the government going forward. So we have some sort of grounded ideas to go from, right? And this is a slide just depicting the 10 values. There were 5 design principles and 5 foundational values. And I could talk about each one of them for hours, right? But I want to focus on 3 things, 2 of the principles and 1 of the values that I think are really relevant for anyone in Canada, but also I think quite helpful when thinking about what a place like UBC can accomplish, right? And so the first one is to acknowledge that there's more certainty than uncertainty. And what we mean by that is that there actually is a pretty clear consensus among experts in energy, in climate change, in sort of systems thinking of what the broad structure of a net zero world looks like. And by that I mean mostly what the energy system looks like, right? And so to speak very broadly about it, is that electricity is going to be generated from net zero sources, as it is here in British Columbia, right? Passenger transportation, as we're starting to get used to here in Vancouver, is going to be electric. Heavier duty transportation, so trucks and whatnot, that may be too large to run purely on electricity, might be some mix of electricity, biofuels, and hydrogen. Heating and cooling of buildings is going to be some mix of waste heat from other processes and electricity, right? Industrial processes are also going to come electric with some role for hydrogen. I could go on like this. It was surprising, but we went around and assessed what all the different experts' reports had said, and they were pretty similar. And so that certainty gives us a little bit of help in making decisions going forward to the future. And I'll say a little bit more on this. But the other principle that I think is really important to think about is avoiding dead ends, right? When we focus on incremental change, incremental emissions reductions are just near-term goals, rather than the really transformative long-term things. When you focus too much on 2025 but not enough on 2050, you can end up on the wrong path. And so there are all sorts of things we can do, the world can do, and the campus can do that could reduce emissions marginally in the short term, but aren't compatible with getting to zero in the long term, right? And the risk of those things is that they lock in systems, they lock in technology that eventually needs to be replaced, usually at great cost to taxpayers. And it often, when we're thinking broader scale beyond campus, it's a big cost to workers as well, right? And there's all sorts of examples of this, from the effort to blend ethanol into gasoline, which doesn't really make a lot of sense if we're trying to replace passenger vehicles, gasoline vehicles with electric vehicles. Why are we blending ethanol into gasoline? It only gets you a marginal emissions reduction. So there's all sorts of examples like this. Another good one that is relevant to campus, larger vehicles, larger trucks. If you convert them to natural gas, you can get like a 40% emission savings. That's really good, but that's as far as you can go. It's not going any lower than that. So what's the plan if we want to go to zero, right? And so the risk with these dead ends is like thinking as if you really want to ski down a steeper slope, but you keep hesitating to turn and you stay on the bunny slope, but at some point you'll miss the chance, right? You won't be able to go down the steeper run. And so what I like about these 2 principles of certainty and of in avoiding dead ends is that they kind of help us make courageous choices. If we use that certainty of the broad strokes of a net zero world to allow us to go further. So if we have a broad sense of what Canada, BC, and the campus needs to look like in 2050 to accomplish all of these goals, then we can reverse engineer. We can say, okay, it's 2023. What are the choices? And we see them around us today. What are the choices we need to make now to make sure we're going to get there and not get stuck down the wrong path, right? And so this helps us avoid the short-term thinking that can end up being more costly in the long run. But those two principles, I wouldn't stick to those alone, because there's a third thing we need, one of the values that I think is really important. And the value was collaborate every step of the way. And I want to highlight this one because whatever choices we make, they need to be grounded in the reality for people that live and work in this country, and in our cases, live and work on campus and in all the surrounding communities. So that means doing this as has begun in full collaboration with our Musqueam hosts and through respectful dialogue with one another and through collaboration with partners that aren't on campus but who will be affected by some of the decisions that the campus makes. And remembering always that we have an opportunity but also a responsibility, a leadership responsibility to demonstrate what's possible. Oh, I went too far. So the question is, how do we operate? I can give you these principles, right? How do we operationalize all of this, right? So in terms of emissions, if you want to look at like the carbon footprint of the Lower Mainland, right, of Metro Vancouver, about half of emissions come from operating buildings, from basically heating and cooling buildings, right? And about a quarter comes from transportation, and that's going to be transportation on roads, ferries, and long-distance ferries and air travel would not be counted in that budget. And then the other quarter comes from a variety of other sources, right? And so we have a sense of what it is. If we were in another jurisdiction, electricity would be in there, but it isn't for us, right? But when we zoom into campus, the campus operations itself, 97% of the emissions comes from heating and cooling buildings, right? Because we've done a good job of eliminating the other sources of emissions. But also it's misleading. So I'm going to show you this slide. This is from some of the campus emissions reporting. And you can see the emissions numbers. Don't even worry about the units. These can all just be seen as relative. In green, those are from the campus itself, or what we would call scope 1 or 2 emissions. So UBC buildings and energy is the major source of emissions, right? But we have this huge footprint that extends off campus. What about all the commuting that comes to campus? That's partly our responsibility as well, right? It's people who are here today and are work on campus that are commuting here, right? What about all the products that we use on campus? The food, the embodied carbon, and all the goods that are on campus, right? Emissions that were generated to produce those things, right? And so the scope 3 emissions, which is the technical term for things that happen outside your jurisdiction, they're about 2.5 times the emissions on campus. And so when I talk about us having a responsibility to the communities around us, there's a literal one as well in terms of we are responsible for some emissions that happen not from the campus itself. But it also means we have leverage, right? This is a way that decisions we make and policies we pass on campus can influence way beyond the borders of the campus itself, right? So that's one example of things we can do. So on buildings, there's all sorts of things we can do on campus with the actual campus with the campus operations buildings, but with the community as well, with the neighborhood as well, to demonstrate what a livable net zero community looks like to other parts of the Lower Mainland and beyond, right? And on transportation, we have an advantage to say, okay, there's not a lot of vehicle use on campus, but how we design parking, where we put chargers, what sort of policies we put into place, I have all sorts of suggestions I can give you, influence decisions that are being made outside of campus, what car somebody decides to buy, how they decide to move around, and then influences their community as well, right? And the same goes for the sort of embodied carbon, like what sort of food we sell and what we expect out of those food products, right? The challenge, of course, is doing some of this and doing all of these things that are all around us on these boards today. It's going to be hard, right? Here are the big ideas from one of the the 6 big ideas. I'm missing actually the diagram for climate mitigation and adaptation. I apologize. Here are the 6 big ideas. And the thing is, if you polled everyone in this room and everybody on campus, they're going to weight, every single one of us would weight them differently. How much we like or dislike one of them, or how much we value or don't value one of them, right? Our values are going to come into conflict for sure in trying to do this, right? Just think about some of the goals. We have a rising population in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, and the campus is trying to figure out how to accommodate some of that, right? But we also have to take into account housing affordability. At the same time, we want to make buildings going to net zero, and that could cost more money for somebody to build them, at least for now, right? Particularly if we want to use materials that come from low carbon sources, right? And then we also need to be thinking about livability, right? So these things are inevitably going to lead to disagreements. And there's already people that are upset about some of the plans that are here, and I think the people from campus community planning can tell you that. I received emails about it in advance to this today. But then again, I'll ask you, if we can't, with all of our privileges and advantages, if we can't find a way to come together on this, how do we expect anyone else to do it, right? Thinking again about all the advantages we have. So this opportunity we have is to demonstrate not just what's technologically possible, because we're a research university that understands science and technology. It's to demonstrate what is politically possible. That despite disagreements, we can come up with compromises that everyone will be okay with and will still accomplish these goals. Because that's what the world's trying to figure out how to do right now. How do you marry all these different goals together while still making sure we are reducing emissions enough, right? And so, in my mind, the world, the country, and the campus to some degree, we're there at the top of the mountain, skis or snowboard on, and we're deciding which direction to go, right? Which run are we going to take? And the nice thing about this plan being expedited and us needing to get this out, a plan for 2050, to the Board of Governors soon, is that the longer you put off these things, the faster that snow is going to melt, right? We need to do this now, right? And so the one thing I can close with on this is a piece of good news from the experts, I guess. Experts will tell you that the foundational skills you need, oh, and by the way, I mean experts in skiing. Experts will tell you that the foundational skills you need to go down the bunny slopes are actually not that different, really, than the ones you need to go down the black diamond, the double black diamond, right? I mean, you need the same equipment, you need the same training, the principles are all the same. It comes down to courage and guts. Do we have the guts to try to go down that more difficult slope? And with courage, it means being decisive and being precise. Really being clear about what we need to accomplish and being decisive about it now and setting the path and not messing around with it, right? When you're skiing down a really steep double black run, if there's a divot in the slope or a bump that gives you an opportunity to turn, you can't miss it. If you miss it, you might hit a tree, right? And the same risk is for us and for the country, right? If we don't take the opportunities when they're here now, we are going to miss them, right? And if we try to do it later, we may hurt ourselves trying to reduce emissions too quickly, right? And so we need to, get down that slope together, right? We have all these advantages and privileges, and we need to demonstrate to people that this is possible, right? This is about UBC not just making decisions for ourselves and how we want the campus to be, but what we need to show the world because we have that responsibility as an institution, like it or not, right? And I think part of this is showing that we can come together, as I've said. And so the one thing I would like to leave everybody with is I really think it's important for everybody to comment on the plan, right? Which is why events like this are held. And I want you to comment, but I want you to tell your friends, your colleagues, your family, if they live on campus and are part of the community, tell them to comment as well. And I want you to tell them to comment even if they're not upset about it. But actually, I want you to tell them to comment especially if they're not upset about it. Because guess what happens in most public consultations? Cities and communities, leaders, hear from people that are really upset about one small piece of a plan sometimes, but maybe not from the big, large silent majority that is happy with it or has smaller concerns. We need to hear from everyone because we need to demonstrate that we can do this so that other communities see that it's possible for them as well. Thank you. And so I'd like to invite Zana to the stage. So Zana Mody is a PhD student in the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability on campus. And she is studying blue carbon ecosystems and carbon uptake and all sorts of things. She's just getting started, so it's still being defined. And Zana has experience working, she was working at Oceanwise, formerly the Vancouver Aquarium, before coming here on youth programs, and was a producer with the CBC before that. So it's a really unique experience and a lot of interesting thoughts to share on this as well. And I think I'll just, that's yours, yeah.
Thanks so much, Simon. Is this on? Yeah? No. Thanks so much, Simon.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, quite a thought-provoking talk. Lots of different points to be touched on, from the global to the local. And I just want to kick off the question and answer period with a few questions of my own, and then we'll open it up to the audience as well. There's 2 mics here if you want to line up after. So Simon, you talked about incremental versus transformative change as it relates to climate action. Can you give some examples of what that would look like specifically on campus as we grow in the next couple of decades?
So I gave a couple broad examples before, and I'll point to 2 things that I can think of that are relevant to the campus, right? So if we know that the long-term goal is net zero, and it can't just be net zero for campus operations, but it's got to be for the entire community, then we might as well immediately say we need any new construction on campus. And I don't mean just campus buildings, I mean housing on campus, for private sale. It's got to be net zero. And it is more expensive to do right now. It is more difficult to do right now because the market isn't there as much. However, again, if we can't show that this is possible, how do we expect the whole region to do it, right? That was one example. And the second one I'm just thinking about, BC is really, within North America, been a bit of a leader in the shift towards electric vehicles, right? Now, the campus can transform its own vehicle fleet, and that's pretty much already underway. But I think we have a great opportunity to, again, influence what's going on off campus, right? There's a segment of the community that is going to continue driving to campus no matter what we do, right? Some people have no choice, right? And that the other modes of transportation aren't possible. What can we do policy-wise on campus to really encourage this shift to electric vehicles, right? And again, this is where those principles I talked about are really helpful. Certainty. Federal government is working on legislation to say every car sold by 2035 has to be zero emissions. Basically saying that there's certainty that we're shifting to electric passenger vehicles. So what creative things could we do on campus around installing charging machines? Installing chargers in the parking garages and charging for it in a way that gives you an incentive for all those people that live in Vancouver and live in an old building where it's going to be hard to find a way to charge your car, or live like in my neighborhood where it's all street parking and you can't even put a charger at your house because you can't get a spot in front of your house. Let's make the campus the place everyone charges their cars, right? Create incentives, right? And so we have to think a little bit outside the box on this stuff.
So it's about foreseeing the changes that we need to make and then developing them as opposed to just reacting to climate crisis and then building the infrastructure for it in some ways.
That's a much better way to put it.
Early in your talk, you touched upon, optimism, pessimism, and courage. And there's another human emotion that is floating around with the climate crisis as well, which is climate anxiety. And I think it also disproportionately affects young people, which will be exposed to the greater impacts of climate change over a longer period of time. And could you talk about how the campus can grow in a way that could help mitigate climate anxiety, especially amongst the student population?
I'm happy to, and the first thing to say is I am not a psychologist. I think that is obvious. But in general, one of the ways I think people combat anxiety is you have to recognize it. It has to be okay to talk about it. And it can feel good to do something. It doesn't necessarily have to directly combat your anxiety, but just to feel involved, right? And so that is where this, I think, the collaboration and really seeing this as a collective mission, right? This is our charge for the next 30 years, is that the campus community needs to prove something. We all have to be a part of it. Even the students are only here for 4 years. That you should still be a part of it, right? I'd add as well that something the campus could do, and I think this would be a great thing for the campus to do in collaboration with the city, and I would say not just Vancouver, but all the cities in the region, is to do more to recognize the climate impacts that have happened and that have caused anxiety, both globally, but particularly locally. What I think is the strangest thing is we've had a terrible few years, on the planet, but here in Canada, and particularly here in the West Coast, and between the pandemic, the opioid crisis, and the climate disasters, there's been so much grief, but there's no public acknowledgement of it. Where is, 700 people died in 2021 because of a heat wave. Nothing like that's ever happened in Vancouver, nothing except that's ever happened in Canada. Where's the plaque? Where's the memorial? Where do you go as a community to go and do that? And the reason I say I think this is important for campus is I'm not saying we build it on campus, but our footprint goes beyond campus. UBC, SFU, there's where the climate experts in Vancouver are. We should be working with the city to put things like this together, right? Maybe it's about the heat wave, maybe it's about the fires in Lytton, maybe it's about the flooding in Abbotsford, et cetera. Maybe it's about the pandemic, right? But just to say that I'm not an expert on grief, but I just wonder if we're not acknowledging what's happened openly enough. And
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I'm thinking about the memorial that was made by Iceland to the glacier that disappeared, the OK Glacier, and that they actually had a eulogy for it as well. And I think it provides a space as well as a connection to place for people to grieve and acknowledge the impacts that climate change has actually had, as opposed to just erasing it from the public awareness. And I think the other element of tackling climate anxiety head on is to talk about action and connection to place as well. And that kind of leads me to my next question, which is, the climate crisis is not just a crisis of material excess, it's also a crisis of narrative. It's a crisis of being removed from the place that you depend upon and the relationships that enable you to survive on a land. And I think the UBC can factor in its cultural and natural heritage as it grows in the next couple of decades, and not just think about the practical elements of growth, such as how do we build more houses without cutting down more trees, or how do we accommodate more commuters without building more parkades? But there are ways to weave in the cultural and natural heritage of this land so that people understand the relationships that this campus is embedded in, such as this is Musqueam traditional territory, this is a rainforest. And I'm not sure if you could elaborate more on that as to how we can grow in a way that's reflective of the landscape itself.
I really appreciate this question, in particular because of the work I do, and particularly the work I've been doing advising the federal government, I can get very caught up in the mechanics of the solutions and forget the spirit of the place sometimes. And so I think it's everything you've raised is incredibly important. One of the ways I think the campus can do this is as I've been sort of saying, we need to be a demonstration project, right? And that is not just demonstrating going to net zero, but it's demonstrating that, hey, a net zero future community is one that's livable, where you feel connected to nature, where you feel connected to the people who are hosting you, right? The land the people whose land you're on, right? And Zana's has given a whole bunch of different examples around this. The reason I think it's really important is we need to be able to show that a net zero community has all of that you can be close to nature. I mean, I think the campus is a fascinating place. It has been true since my first day here, is that it's really striking and beautiful. This really is one of the most beautiful university campuses in the world. But when people say that, they mean the setting, right? They're talking about the view of the mountains and the stairs down to the ocean and the rainforest. They're not necessarily talking about the campus itself. And it's interesting that you can stand in the middle of the campus and not remember that you're on Musqueam land, that the mountains are not far away, that the ocean's right there, The rainforest is right there. And so anything we can do, whether it is through public art, whether it is through, I wouldn't quite use the term rewilding on this scale, but through even just introducing small amounts of natural vegetation, and to even just plazas like the one right outside us, which is oddly very concrete. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think bringing in art and culture and storytelling in design as well, I think is quite important, because then it gets away from the purely functional elements of building and design. So, I mean, if glass and steel and concrete were the best ways to build, in a net zero environment, but that might not be the most conducive way to connect to the landscape. And I think it's important to think about the different elements of design and how they connect people to place and counteract some of the cultural and ecological amnesia that takes place as we grow and develop in a region.
Absolutely. And I'll just add to that, I mean, that's the thing, is that if I'm pushing for net zero buildings, well, they have to be places people want to live. They have to be appealing, right?
Yeah, especially if you're considering higher density type living, where we'll be protecting the green space that already exists, but we want to make sure that the living space is still conducive to a lifestyle that's desirable.
I'm with you 100%.
We're in full agreement here. Okay, well, that being said, we will open up the floor to some questions from the audience for Simon and myself.
Hello. Thank you so much for the talk and for the discussion. I'm curious about the existing buildings. There was a lot of mention about how the heating and cooling took most of the energy of the campus emissions, but from existing buildings. So do you see it as something feasible that some of these emissions can be kind of reversed and they can form part of the buildings that are net zero? Do you think that could be a possibility?
I'm not 100% sure what you mean about the latter part, but in terms of just reducing the emissions from campus, so, a lot of the large majority of the emissions from campus are the use of natural gas in heating and cooling buildings, right? And that is true for the city of Vancouver as well. And the campus has built this district energy system, basically, so a heat system with a central plant. And the challenge going forward, which is part of the 2030 plan, and I'm not the expert on it by any means, right? I'm here as a climate scientist, but the challenge there is kind of the fuel switching. So how do we go to using biofuels? I mean, biofuels are already being used, wood chips, and not using fossil gas or natural gas anymore. And that's the big challenge for here. The other thing to consider is when we start to go to new construction, particularly if it's a little bit further afield, south of 16th, for example. Is everything on the district system? Is it on ground heat pumps, which is our best opportunity to go to zero, but does take a lot of electricity, right? That's what the city is pushing towards, but it's a tough negotiation for the campus. Yeah.
So if I understand, the emissions of the existing buildings when it comes to energy and that transition from fossil fuels into more green forms will be something that it's a bit separated from the actions that the university can take, but will be more like a city or wider level?
Oh no, these are still university actions, it's absolutely. This is definitely something the campus can do, and it is part of the planning. I'm not sure, all I know is that there's plans underway to try to fuel switch for the district energy system, but I think we need somebody from campus planning to answer it better than I could.
I just turned it off. I think it's a really important question, and as Simon said, in the academic part of the campus, we have the bioenergy facility, which is this year going to get us to over 60% reduction of GHGs over 2007 levels. So a big step forward, not there yet, but a big step forward. And then in the neighborhoods, there is a district energy system, and we're just completing studies to do something similar. In that case, it's most likely electrification, but it will be an alternative energy source that's needed to have the similar impact for the residential areas on campus. So that's well underway.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Connor. I'm a resident and a faculty member, and thank you so much. It was a great talk. I really appreciated the graph, actually. My question is for you, but maybe also for campus and community planning as well. What you're talking about is amazing, and I'm just wondering if there's some clarity on if UBC is committing to zero emissions development or even negative emissions development. That's kind of the first part of my question.
I might defer to our campus and community planning
Because
people.
this sounds great. I'm just wondering if what you're presenting is actually what's going to be done.
So for the institutional part of the campus, and I think it was on one of the earlier slides, by 2035, that commitment to net zero. And for scope 1 and 2, and then for scope 3, that is new territory and fairly ambitious in line with the Paris Agreement, but a 45% reduction. That's going to be very challenging, and that's a large part of the focus for the institutional plan. Ironically, the fuel switch on the energy system side is actually the easy thing to do.
Yeah.
And so that the big focus is on the scope 3 emissions. For the neighborhoods, we're developing a climate action plan this year to update the one from 2013 that'll have a similar ambition. We'll develop targets in the early phases of that, and it's just on the heels of that study I was mentioning where we can do the heavy lift through the fuel switch for the energy systems, but it's going to have to look at all the rest of that as well. It gets complicated, but that doesn't mean that we can't take it head on, including how do we get SkyTrain here as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
When you look at reduction of a lot of that graph for reduction of GHGs from commuting. So it's all interconnected and it's complicated, and I think I love the challenge that's thrown down here is that get moving and look for that end goal right out of the gate, because we don't want any dead ends along the way.
So just my follow-up to that is a concerned kind of citizen and somebody who really wants to participate in the survey and give feedback is I think we're being asked to make a lot of decisions right now and give feedback without an environmental assessment plan being in place, or without clarity about if net zero emissions is actually being committed to and if that's going to happen. And when I looked at the 30-year plan, I mean, what you presented was fantastic. When I look at my own neighborhood, Hawthorne, I can see that there's a plan to pull down the rhododendron wood, a big part of it, which is preserved forest, and build a very, very high building, which I imagine can't be mass timber because of its size, which is going to mean steel and concrete. So I'm just wondering, how do we really reconcile this, and how do we give feedback as a community without that kind of data at our disposal about what the actual impacts of this are going to be? And what are your recommendations also when there are ambitious goals like this by a university like UBC to actually achieve those goals in terms of independent monitoring so that they're actually held to that standard, as opposed to saying, we want to do this, but when we tried to, it was too hard, so we didn't.
Actually, Connor, I really appreciate where you're going with these questions. The first thing I should say is, I'm not here necessarily representing the campus plan. I'm just here to talk about it, and that's why I threw out some suggestions that aren't actually in the plan. But, I think part of commenting on any sort of public plan, whether it is the campus community or whether it's the city of Vancouver, whatever, is actually asking the exact questions you're asking, saying, how do you expect me to do this? I think my sense is what people at campus and community planning need to hear is not just people's concerns, complaints, or check marks, but they need to hear, what are your questions, right? So where are the gaps? I would say, in another jurisdiction, I might be more concerned about what you're saying about how do we know we're going to stick to this? How do we know there's, where's the independent monitoring going to be? The one advantage we have, of course, of being a university and having the sustainability office is that there's a rich history here of involving all the academics on campus in assessing what the campus is doing. And so I feel like that's a pretty big opportunity right here. And I imagine that will continue. I don't know if that's written down anywhere, but.
Absolutely. I think that's something that UBC has taken quite seriously about campus as a living lab and partnerships with the academy in the work that we do. I think the proof's in the pudding also, which is the academic part of the campus has grown tremendously, floor space-wise, enrollment-wise, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, hitting 60% reduction this year in GHGs. I think the template is there, and that's what we'll be doing in the neighborhoods. So again, it's taking up the challenge. Don't stop, get moving faster, and do all of this together, which is what we're proposing. And just to clarify one point, if you look at the draft plan, the green academic areas of campus are being preserved, including the UBC farm. Rhododendron wood is being preserved, so I think you might be looking at the area maybe to the south of there in the plan. It's really important to look at that layer to see what's actually being preserved and focusing new development in areas that are going to be near transit or that are already on disturbed land. So I think it takes some time. I would encourage everybody to take some time just to go through the document very, very carefully.
Thanks.
Thanks. And if it's okay, I might just add something as well while the next person comes up. That, I mean, Connor's question about, listen, this area of rhododendrons is probably going to maybe cut down and a big building may go up and it might not, at this stage, we're not getting net zero steel and cement. The world isn't there yet, right? This is the type of thing I think we need to be able to demonstrate that, listen, to do this, particularly to do this now, there are going to be trade-offs. I don't just mean on campus. I mean, buildings are going to be built in the Lower Mainland. Trees are going to be cut down. It's how it's done, how it's agreed upon, and making sure that the trade-off is worth it, basically, right? And so I think part of it is we need to demonstrate we can come together and make these decisions in a good way.
Thank you. I hope this doesn't mess up the microphone. Okay, thanks. Great. So yeah, a question for you, Simon. First of all, I'm Eagle Glassheim. I'm a professor in the history department, and I'm a resident of the Westbrook neighborhood. And I also am a board member of the UNA Board of Directors, so I'm involved in a lot of different ways here. But I was really inspired by your call for us to find ways to get net zero across the range of activities that go on around the campus, including construction. And you had some ideas on things that you can do to get net zero buildings in terms of energy systems and heating and cooling. My question has to do with possibilities for net zero in terms of embodied carbon of construction, because this is the really big issue for our neighborhoods. And in particular, I wonder what you would think of the proposal to put a moratorium on the construction of towers around campus and in the neighborhoods of concrete and steel, and only build height if you can build with mass timber technology, which is one of those kind of wedge technologies, I think. So I'll leave my question there.
No, I appreciate the question. So the first thing to say is I'm not an expert on building technology, so I'm not going to claim I have the right answer to this. I like the principle, and I like the principle of obviously we've done more mass timber buildings, not just because of the potential for being zero or close to zero emissions construction, but because of what we do here, right? And what the expertise is and where we are in the province and what we can prove to other places by doing that. I'm personally a bit wary of moratoriums because I think we do need to think seriously about the other part that we need to demonstrate, that the population of the Lower Mainland is going up, and we need to make sure we are accommodating some of that out of fairness. That's my opinion. I realize we're not all going to necessarily agree on this. And it may be that a moratorium isn't the right way to go about it, but that we could prioritize certain types of building, but recognize that, maybe certain buildings, in order to build the type of housing that might be necessary in the future, we might need to look to, there may need to be, some steel and concrete construction. I'm honestly not sure. I'm not enough of an expert on the details of this. But just to say that I'm not convinced always that a moratorium is the best way to go about it, that sometimes we aiming for perfect when you could get 80%, right? That I wouldn't die on the hill of fighting for a ban on something if you can get most of the way without it, if you understand my point, yeah. And just one point to add on concrete and steel. They are among the biggest challenges in getting the country or the world to net zero. It is making steel or concrete with steel with zero emissions is very difficult. Concrete is next to impossible because it's literally chemistry of the creation of concrete. And it's one of the reasons that scientists use the term net zero rather than zero, which is that we don't think it's logistically possible to actually eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions from human activity, but we could counter some sectors of emissions through pulling CO2 out of the air. We don't want to rely on it for things we can eliminate, but for things we think we can't eliminate, otherwise, maybe it's the only option.
Hey, I'm Jose. I'm an international student from Mexico, Otomi territories, and I really appreciate everyone who's giving like a little bit of positionality in there. I'm someone who's been engaging with student leadership around campus vision from the terms of reference to just attending events, and I think it's a great way to engage. So I want to acknowledge that I'm grateful that this is something that has been done. However, I do see how there's a lot of disagreement and different points of view. I think we've seen this today. And I mean, you do have experience with the IPCC and with kind of like the more global aspect of understanding the nuances and the different contexts of people. You were talking about the pie. So do you have any advice on how we de-escalate and how do we deal with the pie? How do we understand what pieces of pie are going to be given? It's hard to navigate, especially if you're a student and you think there's a lot of problems with housing and affordability, food security, and growth is not that simple of a question of do we want to still do this? Like for me, it's international tuition. For me, it's many other things, and this is really intertwined. So, just wanted to say that.
No, I really appreciate it, and it's great to see students and some familiar student faces from across campus here. Honestly, I mean, I presented the sort of ski slopes graph and talked about the pie to give you kind of the international framing, the way myself and a lot of other people who spend their lives working on the science of this issue think about it, and sort of where some of the policy comes from, right? Sort of showing where do the Paris Climate Agreement targets come from, where does net zero by 2050 come from, how do we end up thinking about where BC and Canada and Vancouver and the campus is in that context. I do think, though, that sometimes we get too fixated on these numbers, and it's strange for a scientist to be saying that, because when it comes down to it, like the fundamental message, like the fundamental thing here of climate science is that the more we emit, the more the planet warms, and the more people are impacted by it. And if you flip that around, the faster we reduce emissions, the less the planet warms, and the less people in the environment are going to suffer as a result. And so I present the framework I do to help us get motivated and think about what's possible. But on a daily basis, all I want people to remind themselves is the more we do, the better, right? And don't worry every moment about the target. Just worry that we're doing as much as we can. Yeah. I don't know if that helps at all, Jose, but not really.
I guess it's the dilemma of the hardest change for society to adapt to a low carbon future would actually be the best off situation for everyone, would be less harmful overall.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Leah. I'm also an undergraduate student at UBC.
Awesome.
I guess my question, I think, is a pretty classic young student coming to sustainability event question, and that is, often we come to these events and we see the importance of institutional change and large-scale change and sort of originally see it as the only way to make an impact is sort of having a position of power and getting your foot in the door in a room where those decisions are being made. And I think that that's really hard. I mean, it's really hard for students to get to see that. And I think what it often leads to is students, or just, all sorts of people not feeling like they are able to make a difference, that them, eating less red meat or taking the bus that day is actually going to make any change. And I think that that mental opinion or mental view of not thinking that they have the personal ability to make the change also leads to people not caring or being as passionate about sustainability and sort of leading to that institutional change. That hopefully makes sense.
Yeah.
I find that that's something in my leadership roles on campus I run into all the time as a conversation piece. And I guess I'm curious if you have any advice or opinions on sort of how do we balance those. And, you know, it's true. People's individual actions have such little consequence, I guess, in this large world. But I would argue that the mental shift towards being aware of sustainability and climate action does have that impact. So just looking on advice on how to balance them, how to have those conversations, and sort of how you would encourage, you know, people who don't necessarily have a foot in the door in those institutional conversations to make a difference.
I love that. Do you have anything? Okay. First of all, thank you for coming, and I really love that question. We have these conversations in class sometimes. Listen, this is difficult because there are things that any individual can do to have an impact on climate change. They're reducing emissions, choices you make in your own life. But as a middle-aged university professor, I also don't feel right asking somebody your age to be in the position that they have to make those individual choices, because we haven't done a good enough job setting the incentives to make those choices easy, right? And so, yes, you can choose how to travel, you can choose how to heat and cool your home, although not if you're renting, right? And all these sorts of things, you choose what food you eat and everything, those can have an impact, and I encourage everybody to do them. But recognize that the reason more people aren't making those choices is because we don't have policies in place that have set the incentives the right way. And so that's why the whole thing about getting your foot in the door to make a change is so important. What I would point to instead is that just to say that to have an impact, like civically, you don't need to be in the room with the people making the decision. You just need to make sure your voice is heard. And there's all sorts of ways to do that, whether from voting to writing letters to showing up to events and everything. What's difficult is that you don't get the feedback. There's no dopamine hit of knowing that you made an impact, right? That's what's so hard. That's why people don't write letters very often, because you're like, well, what's going to happen? Is anyone going to read it? Well, it turns out research shows that like past a certain number of letters, the staff have to bring something to the minister and say, the minister, you need to think about this because we've had enough constituents write about it. And so I find that I like to think of this, and I do this as well with just my role as a scientist, that sometimes your role is to add sand to the pile, right? And to just by talking to people and by getting the message out, talking to your family, right? If your parents, your siblings, your cousins, et cetera, don't think about this issue, but you're learning about it at school, tell them what you're learning, right? That you're adding sand to the pile, and we need to keep adding sand to the pile for it to get higher. That's how the institution of science works, right? It's not that I'm so brilliant or that any one person is the reason the IPCC exists. It's that all the scientists around the world add sand to the pile of climate science. It gets big enough that we can write a report, right? And I don't know if that necessarily makes you feel better, but I'll tell you, as a scientist, I really like when we have a piece of research come out, I take pride in knowing I'm adding to the knowledge, right? Adding to the pile. And that's, I think, how you should feel when you write a letter to your representative, when you come to an event like everything, you're adding to the pile. Yeah.
I would also add that the way that institutions can empower and enable individuals to do change is to make change visible. So for example, if a building changes its heating system to a heat pump and is more sustainable, I think they can add like an informational placard or make it just visible to people that are in the vicinity that this change has been made. Or when we talk about things such as integrating rain gardens or more tree canopy, and just making it visible so that you're surrounded in this cultural and ecological context that is progressive, and you're absorbing it almost subconsciously as you walk around the campus. And then that, I think, psychologically enables people to feel more motivated because they're not just surrounded by an environment that subtly disconnects them from their environment. And I think, just immersing people in that progressive mentality in that environment, I think, is quite important. And I think institutions can lead the way in that and also empower people that way.
Hi, thanks. I just want to build on, my name is Megan, I'm from the Climate Hub at UBC, and one of the things that we focus on is student-driven climate action, climate change rooted in principles of climate justice. And I just want to build on some of the comments that I've been hearing in the dialogue, and I want to take it back to systems. A common slogan we hear from youth is systems change, not climate change. And we also noted the IPC noted colonialism as a system that is driving climate change as well, for example. We also know systems like capitalism and neoliberalism are driving a lot of the things behind the challenges that we face in regards to climate change. And so I'm kind of thinking about when we're talking about these changes and we're talking about development and we're thinking long term, both mid, medium, and long term, how are we integrating a different understanding of the systems that are getting us into these challenges to begin with? So for example, if we're thinking about Campus Vision 2050, how are we thinking about degrowth principles or circular economy or donut economics, for example, instead of just kind of staying within the confines of capitalism or neoliberalism? How do we know that the development or the businesses that are brought onto campus are feeding into a different type of system? And so I just would like to hear both of your thoughts on how we integrate deeper systems shifts and changes so that we know that the trajectories that we're on are actually shifting what's creating our challenges to begin with, if that makes sense. So I'd like to hear that, yeah, and how students can actually help to encourage norm shift on systems change as well.
I appreciate the comment, and also to say, if you're not a member of the Climate Hub, that's a great way to start. There we go. You know, I wish I had like an easy answer for you, and I don't. But I will say, this is a little bit of what I meant when we're not all going to agree. And I don't mean you and I necessarily not agreeing, but I mean we're not all going to agree, right? Not everyone's going to agree on degrowth, for example. Right? But what I think it's so important for us to be able to do is to have everything you just said at the table, right? And to have everyone who agrees with you to feel like whatever comes out in the end, even if it's not quite what they wanted, they at least can understand they're okay with it because enough voices were heard. And maybe it's not quite the solution I wanted, but I recognize that, well, I'm not saying that you are, but like just in case, just rhetorically, we were in the minority, and so we can't assume that our ideas were going to be taken up, but some of them were adopted in certain ways, and I'm going to be okay with that. Like, because in the end, we have no choice but to compromise. And I say this not because of what I think is the right thing the campus should do because of my own personal beliefs. I say it because I really think we need to demonstrate this to other places. Because if the campus can't do this in a civil way, I don't know how we expect anyone else to. Yeah.
I think that is probably a very good segue to conclude tonight's discussion. And just before I thank our guests here tonight, this point about uncomfortable conversations, deeper engagement, it's something that we are endeavoring to undertake, and I think the team is doing a great job to get out into the community and have these conversations. And as you said, there's a composite of interests across the screen. How do we best address the interests and take action to reduce GHGs? How do we do all of that? And the particular interface, I think I've heard it tonight, we've heard it in several conversations, the interface with cultural and natural history and the place, the livability of the place, our relationship with our Indigenous hosts, what it means for the natural environment. All of this needs to come together. And it isn't going to be, I don't think it's going to be perfect, but I think we can come up with a very good plan that addresses those interests. And we want to hear from you throughout this process, as we have been. Tell us about what you think about the plan, and tell us, to this challenge, what are some of the ways through? Because I don't think there's going to be a moratorium on development. But if we are going to grow in a region that's growing, how do we do it in a way that's responsible and makes a difference? So I really appreciate the presentation tonight, the conversation that we've had. I want to thank our guests for coming out tonight. And I think there's more opportunity, obviously, through the work that you do to engage more specifically in the areas of expertise that you've been describing tonight. So not just about Campus Vision 2050, but with you as well. So thank you very much. There is, I think it's going to come up on the screen. Obviously, the website will be a portal into different ways to engage, whether it's the survey or the workshops that are coming up, the open houses, and events like this. And we do and will continue to go to where you are, groups that want to have us come and have further discussions. Please take us up on it. But with that, thank you very much, Simon, Zana, for a wonderful conversation. And thanks to the team for hosting us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.